The divorce papers were still warm from the elder's seal when Gareth pressed them into Josie's hands and turned his back on her. He didn't look at her face. He didn't need to. He already knew what he would find there. Those pale gray eyes, wide and stunned, the kind of expression an animal makes when it realizes the trap has already closed. He had seen that look before, on the faces of Omegas who had been cast out of packs far crueler than his. He told himself this was different. He told himself this was necessary. He was wrong about the first part. He was not entirely wrong about the second. Josie stood in the doorway of the house that had been hers for 2 years. The house with the blue-painted shutters she had chosen herself. The herb garden she had planted along the south wall. The creaking third step she had learned to avoid on cold mornings. And she held the papers with both hands because one hand was not enough to hold something that heavy. The wax seal of the Coldridge pack pressed into her palm like a brand. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, lazy and indifferent, dusting the stone path in white. She was 22 years old. She had nowhere to go. The village of Coldridge sat at the base of the Ironspine Mountains, a cluster of timber and stone buildings huddled together like animals sharing warmth. It was not a cruel place, not exactly. But it had the particular unkindness of small communities, the kind built from silence and sideways glances, from conversations that stopped when the wrong person entered a room. Josie had learned this in the 2 years since Gareth had brought her here as his chosen mate, the Omega daughter of a traveling merchant from the Eastern Valleys. She had learned it more thoroughly in the hours after he had unmatched her. By the time she reached the village square, people already knew. She could tell by the way old Marin from the weaving shop turned slightly away. By the way the blacksmith's apprentice suddenly found something urgent to examine on his boot. By the way a cluster of women near the grain stall lowered their voices without quite stopping their conversation. She kept her chin level. She kept her steps even. She had her gray wool cloak pulled tight against the cold, her pale blonde braid hanging over one shoulder. And she carried a single leather satchel, because that was all she had been permitted to take. The papers were folded inside her bodice, against her heart, because there was nowhere else to put them. She was trying very hard not to think about the herb garden. The single place she could go, the only place she had any claim to, was a half-day's walk east of the village, past the old mill and through the stand of pine trees that marked the edge of Coldridge territory, her father's roadside inn. She had not been there in 3 years. She was not entirely sure it was still standing. Her father, Willem, had built the inn with his own hands 30 years ago on the trade road, between Coldridge and the mountain passes. For 2 decades it had been a decent place. Warm hearth, clean straw, a pot of something hot always on the fire. Travelers rested there. Merchants watered their horses. Occasionally a patrol of pack soldiers came through and drank Josie's mother's pine bark ale and left copper coins on the table. It had been a life. A modest one, but real. Then Willem's lungs had begun to fail, and the work became too much. And Josie had married Gareth partly because she loved him, and partly because she had been terrified of being left alone in that fading inn, with a dying father and an empty road. She had chosen safety. She had chosen the blue shutters and the herb garden and the pack at her back. She had chosen wrong. The inn appeared through the pine trees just as the light was going gray and thin, the sun swallowed by cloud cover, and the snow falling harder now, sticking to her cloak and eyelashes. Josie stopped at the tree line and looked at it for a long moment. It was not gone. That was the best she could say. The sign above the door, the Pine Reach Inn, her father had called it, though everyone on the road simply called it Willem's, hung from one chain, the other having rusted through at some point in the last 3 years. The wooden board swayed in the cold wind, knocking softly against the stone wall. The shutters were warped. The vegetable plot her mother had kept along the eastern wall was nothing but frozen mud and dead stalks. One of the stable doors was hanging open, and snow was drifting in across the old straw floor. But the stone walls were solid. The roof, as far as she could see, was intact. And the hearth, the great iron hearth that her father had been so proud of, wide enough to roast a full deer, set deep into the north wall, had not been touched. It would need cleaning. The flue would need checking. But it was there. Josie breathed out slowly through her nose. The cold air tasted of pine resin and ice, and the faint ghost of old wood smoke. All right, she thought. All right. She pushed the front door open. The hinges screamed. She worked through the night. She had no choice. Stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant feeling. And feeling meant the particular kind of collapse she could not afford in a cold building with no fire yet lit. So she worked. She found an old broom behind the kitchen wall and swept 3 years of dust and dead leaves from the common room floor. She dragged the broken furniture outside. She found a dry stack of split wood under an oilcloth behind the stable and carried it inside armload by armload, her back aching, her fingers going numb inside her thin gloves. The hearth took 4 attempts to light. The flue had a partial blockage, a bird's nest, she thought, maybe 2, and the first 3 tries filled the common room with smoke before she climbed up onto the roof in the dark and the snow and cleared it with a long iron rod she found hanging in the stable. Her boots slipped twice on the icy shingles. She caught herself both times. The 4th attempt caught. She sat on the cold stone floor in front of the growing fire and pressed her palms flat against the hearth, letting the warmth travel up through her wrists and elbows and into the deep cold that had settled in her chest, somewhere around the time Gareth had turned his back on her. The fire crackled and popped. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like breathing. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not do that until she had earned it, until there was heat in the building and food in her stomach and a reason to believe this was survivable. She was still working on the last part. Her father's old iron pot was still hanging above the hearth. She found dried beans in a sealed crock in the kitchen, and the end of a rope of dried onions, and a small crock of salt that had gone slightly damp but was still usable. She made a thin soup and ate it standing up because the bench was still outside in the snow. It was the best thing she had eaten in months. She hadn't realized until that moment how long she had been hungry, not for food, but for the specific comfort of something she had made herself, in a place that belonged to no one but her. She slept on her cloak on the floor beside the hearth. She woke before dawn to the sound of hooves on the frozen road outside. She lay very still for a moment, listening. More than one horse. Heavy animals by the sound of it. War horses or mountain breeds, not the light-footed traders' ponies she was used to hearing on this road. And with the horses, she could hear something else beneath the wind. Low voices, disciplined and brief. The kind of communication that didn't waste words. Pack soldiers. She rose, straightened her cloak, tucked her braid back, and went to the door. There were 7 of them on the road in front of the inn, and in the gray pre-dawn light, she could see that they wore the black leather and iron of the Velthar pack. Mountain wolves, from the high territory above the passes. She had heard of the Velthar the way all pack border people heard of them. Carefully, and with great respect. They were the oldest pack in the mountain range. Their alpha king had held the high territory for 12 years without a single successful challenge. 6 of the 7 riders were watching the tree line with the focused attention of people who had reason to be watchful. The 7th was watching her. He sat at the front of the group on a horse so black it was nearly invisible in the pre-dawn dark. A great broad-shouldered animal that stood perfectly still despite the cold and the wind. The man on its back wore black leather armor over a dark tunic, thick straps crossing his chest, leather bracers on his forearms. A heavy fur mantle, wolf fur, black, lay across his shoulders. His dark hair was drawn back in long braids, and even in the dim light Josie could see the sharpness of his eyes, pale and intent, the color of winter sky. There was a cut along his jaw, recent, still raw. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "Is there a fire inside?" Josie held the doorframe with one hand and looked back at him, at all of them, the armed wolves on their mountain horses in the snow, and thought about the thin bean soup and the one dry log she had left, and the divorce papers still folded against her heart. "There is," she said. "But the inn is not open." The Alpha King tilted his head slightly, as though this was not the answer he had expected. "It will be," he said. It was not a question. Josie did not move from the doorway. She was aware, painfully, precisely aware, of what she was looking at. 7 Velthar wolves on war horses in the snow, armed and road-worn and carrying the particular stillness of people who were accustomed to being obeyed. The kind of men who did not knock on doors. The kind of men doors simply opened for. And their Alpha King, sitting at the front of them with a fresh cut on his jaw and winter sky eyes that had not left her face since she'd stepped outside. She knew she should step back. She knew she should bow her head and open the door wider and say, "Of course, my lord," and ask how many bowls of whatever she had would be needed. That was what an Omega did, especially an unmated one, especially one standing alone on the edge of pack territory, with no one at her back. She didn't move. "The inn is not open," she said again. "The hearth is mine. The fire is mine. I lit it 4 hours ago after clearing the flue in the dark and the snow, and I have exactly 1 dry log left and enough dried beans to feed myself for 3 days if I'm careful." One of the riders shifted in his saddle. Another exchanged a glance with the man beside him. The Alpha King did not move at all. "I'm not asking for charity," Josie continued, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "If your men need warmth and you have coin, we can talk about what that's worth. But I will not be told what my own hearth will be." And the silence that followed lasted long enough that the wind had time to push a drift of snow across the road between them. Then the Alpha King did something she did not expect. He almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive. It was more like the shadow of one, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and produced a coin. Not a copper, not even a silver. A gold mark, the kind that didn't circulate in border villages, the kind Josie had only ever seen twice in her life. He held it up between 2 fingers. "For the fire," he said. "And whatever else you have. My men have been riding since before yesterday's dawn." Josie looked at the gold coin. She looked at the 7 tired wolves on their tired horses in the falling snow. She looked at the Alpha King's jaw, at the cut that someone had given him recently enough that it hadn't yet begun to properly heal, which meant he had been riding hard through the night instead of resting. She stepped back from the doorway. "Boots off at the entrance," she said. "I just swept that floor." His name, she learned, was Roman. She learned it not from him, but from his second, a broad, dark-skinned man named Kale, who had the watchful eyes of someone whose entire occupation was noticing things that might kill his alpha before his alpha noticed them himself. Kale was the one who organized the horses into the stable, who directed the other 5 men with short, efficient gestures, who checked the corners of the common room before allowing anyone to sit down. He was also, Josie noticed, the one who watched her most carefully while pretending not to watch her at all. She didn't take it personally. She understood his job. Roman sat at the end of the long table nearest the hearth and said almost nothing for the first hour. He drank the pine bark tea she brewed from the dried bark she found in her father's old herb chest, and he ate 2 bowls of bean soup without commenting on the fact that it was thin and slightly oversalted, and he watched the fire with the concentrated focus of a man working through something difficult in his mind. The cut on his jaw was from a blade. She was certain of that now, close enough to see it clearly while refilling his cup. Clean edge, deliberate angle. Not a branch or a fall. Someone had tried to put a knife through the Alpha King's face recently and had come close enough to leave a mark. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't her business. What was her business was the slow calculation running in the back of her mind as she moved between the kitchen and the common room. The gold mark on the table, the 6 additional men who would each need feeding, the state of her supply stores, what the trade road looked like in winter, and how often riders came through, what the inn would need before it could receive paying guests reliably. The list was long. The gold mark was a beginning. It was Kale who spoke to her first, while Roman was outside checking on the horses. He came to the kitchen doorway and leaned against the frame in a way that was casual on the surface and entirely deliberate underneath, and he looked at her with those noticing eyes. "You're Willem's daughter," he said. Josie looked up from where she was scraping the soup pot. "You knew my father?" "Stopped here 4 years ago. He was a good man. Good ale." He paused. "He passed?" 2 years ago, just before winter." Cale nodded slowly. His gaze moved around the kitchen, the swept floor, the sorted herbs, the pot on the fire, and she could see him assembling a picture from the pieces. "You've been here one night." "Yes. And you've already cleaned it, lit the hearth, cleared the flue, and fed 7 wolves. 8, counting myself." Something shifted in his expression, not quite respect. Something more cautious than that, the kind of reassessment a careful person makes when the situation turns out to be different from what they expected. "Where's your pack?" Josie set the pot down. "I don't have one." The silence that came after that was a specific kind of silence. The kind that meant he understood more than she had said. An unmated Omega woman alone on the border road in winter without pack protection was not a situation that happened accidentally. It was a situation that was done to someone. "I see," Cale said quietly. "I'd rather you didn't," Josie said, and turned back to the fire. Roman came back inside bringing cold air and the smell of pine and horse, and he stood at the entrance knocking snow from his boots with the methodical focus of someone performing an ordinary task while thinking about something else entirely. When he straightened, and his eyes found Josie across the room, she had the strange sensation of being looked at rather than merely seen, the difference between a glance and an assessment. "The stable roof has a weak section," he said, "over the eastern stall." "I know. I have it on my list. Your list. Of things that need repairing." She began stacking the emptied bowls. "It's a long list. The stable roof is approximately 7th. He crossed to the table and sat back down. In the firelight, the cut on his jaw looked worse than it had in the pre-dawn gray outside, deeper at the center, the skin around it starting to show the early bruising of a wound that had been ignored too long. "You should clean that," she said, without particularly meaning to say it aloud. He looked at her. "The cut," she clarified. "It's been too long since it happened. Another few hours and you'll have a proper infection, and then it will be the least of your problems." The 5 soldiers at the other end of the table had gone very quiet. Cale, near the hearth, had developed a sudden and intense interest in his tea. Roman held her gaze for a moment. His expression was difficult to read, not offended, not amused, something more opaque than either. "Do you have what's needed?" he asked. "I found my father's medicine chest this morning. There's yarrow and pine resin if the yarrow isn't too old." She paused. "I'll look." She cleaned the wound at the table by firelight while the other men talked quietly among themselves, or tried to sleep sitting up, or pretended with varying degrees of success not to watch. Roman sat very still while she worked, which she appreciated. She had tended her father's injuries in his final years, the clumsy accidents of a man whose hands were no longer fully reliable, and she knew the difference between someone who was enduring something and someone who was simply present in it. Roman was the latter. He didn't flinch when the yarrow paste touched the cut. He didn't shift or look away. He sat with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was a form of strength. She worked carefully, pressing the cleaned edges together with her fingers, before binding them with a strip of linen soaked in pine resin. "You've done this before," he said quietly. Not a challenge, an observation. "My father was ill for a long time." She tied off the linen. He needed help. "Who helped you?" The question was unexpected. She smoothed the edge of the binding without answering immediately, taking a moment that she used to decide how much truth to offer a stranger. "I managed," she said. Roman looked at her steadily. In the firelight, his eyes were less like winter sky and more like deep water. Not cold exactly, but containing a depth she could not see the bottom of. "The inn," he said. How long before it can take regular travelers? Josie stepped back and folded the remaining linen. 2 weeks if I can get supplies. 3 if I can't. What do you need? Timber for the stable, new chain for the sign, grain and salt and oil. She looked at him directly. Why? Because we travel this road every month, he said simply. And we will need somewhere to stop. It was a practical statement, a transactional one. There was no kindness offered in it, and no warmth intended. It was the language of a man who operated in terms of need and use and arrangement. But standing in the warm circle of the hearth, she had lit herself. In the inn, she had swept herself, with the yarrow scent of her father's medicine chest still on her fingers. Josie heard something underneath the practicality that she hadn't been offered in a very long time. She heard someone who assumed she would succeed. Then we have an arrangement, she said. They left at dawn. Roman was last to mount, and for a moment he stood beside his horse in the pale morning light and looked back at the inn, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the repaired stable door she had secured with a new wooden peg the night before, at the sign swaying on its single chain. He didn't look at Josie. But Cale did, from his saddle, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite name. Something between concern and calculation. The look of a man adding a figure into a sum he was still working out. The horses disappeared into the pine trees. Josie stood at the door and watched them go, and then she turned and looked at the common room, at the fire burning low, at the gold coin still sitting on the table where Roman had left it. She picked it up. Then she picked up the broom and started on the second day. 2 weeks passed like cold water, fast and relentless, and wearing everything smooth. Josie worked from before dawn until after dark every day, and she kept a tally on the inside of the kitchen wall in charcoal marks, not of the days, but of the tasks completed. New timber for the stable, bartered from the sawmill at the edge of Coldridge territory, in exchange for 3 weeks of meals for the miller's apprentice, who traveled the road daily and was tired of eating cold bread. New chain for the sign, purchased with a portion of the gold mark from a metalworker in the village who had the grace not to ask her name. Salt, grain, dried peas, smoked fish, a small crock of rendered fat. 2 new iron hooks for the kitchen wall. She didn't go into Coldridge itself. She sent the miller's apprentice, a boy of 15 named Pip, who had attached himself to the inn with the cheerful persistence of a stray dog, for anything that required the market square. She wasn't avoiding Gareth. She told herself she wasn't avoiding Gareth. She simply had no business in the village and a great deal of business on the road, and it was more efficient to send Pip. Pip, for his part, seemed to find the whole arrangement extremely exciting. He had taken to sweeping the stable without being asked, and feeding the 2 horses Josie had acquired in a second barter, an old bay mare and a wall-eyed gray gelding, both past their prime, both useful, and occasionally falling asleep on the bench by the hearth after supper, and having to be sent home in the dark. "You should let him sleep here," said Nora. Nora was the other unexpected addition to Josie's first 2 weeks. She was perhaps 50, a heavy-set woman with iron-gray hair and hands that were permanently stained with wood ash from decades of tending fires in other people's hearths. She had appeared at the inn's door on the 4th day, carrying a bundle of dried herbs and a blunt expression, and announced that she had heard Willem's daughter had come back to open the place, and she wanted work. She had previously cooked for a traveling merchant's household for 20 years, until the merchant died and the household dissolved. She could make 5 meals from a single marrow bone. She had opinions about everything, and expressed them freely. Josie had hired her on the spot. "He has a mother," Josie said regarding Pip. "His mother works the night shift at the tannery. He's eating cold porridge for supper and sleeping alone." Nora turned a round of dough with practiced efficiency. "He's useful and he likes it here. Let him sleep in the stable." Josie looked at the charcoal marks on her kitchen wall. Then she looked at the stable, where she could hear Pip singing something tuneless to the gray gelding. "Clean straw," she said, "and he eats at the table." Nora smiled at the dough. Already assumed. The inn opened, truly opened. with the sign rehung on 2 good chains and a fire burning, and a pot of Nora's barley stew on the hearth, on the 15th day. The first paying guests were a wool merchant and his 2 assistants, headed south before the mountain passes closed for deep winter. They paid in silver, ate everything put in front of them, slept heavily, and left at dawn with clean boots and warm stomachs. The merchant paused at the door and told Josie it was the best stop on the eastern road. She stood in the doorway after he'd gone and let herself feel it, just for a moment, just a breath's worth, the particular satisfaction of a thing built from nothing. Then she went back inside and started on the lunch fire. They came back on the 17th day. She heard the horses before she saw them. That same heavy, deliberate rhythm she had catalogued in her memory without meaning to. And she was standing at the stable door checking on the hay supply when the Velthar riders came through the pine trees in the late afternoon light. 7 of them again, the same formation, Roman at the front. He looked different than she remembered, and the same. The cut on his jaw had healed cleanly. She could see the thin new scar from 20 feet away, pale against his skin. He wore the same black leather and fur mantle, but his posture had something different in it today. A tension held in the line of his shoulders that hadn't been there before, or that she hadn't noticed. Cale was watching her from his saddle with those careful eyes. "The stable has room for 6 horses," she said, before anyone had spoken. "The other 2 will need to be tied at the east post. I have barley feed and fresh water." She looked at Roman. "Same arrangement as before?" "Same arrangement," he said. She nodded and went to take the first horse's bridle. It was Cale who told her in the kitchen, while Nora was clattering through the preparation of supper with the focused aggression she brought to all cooking tasks. "There was a challenge," he said quietly. "At the high seat, 3 days ago, a coalition. 3 pack leaders from the northern valleys. They came with 20 men." Josie kept her hands busy with the bread she was slicing. And it's handled." He paused. "But one of them is still out there. Edric. He ran when the others fell. He's in the mountain passes somewhere, and he's angry, and he has allies we haven't fully mapped yet." She set the bread knife down. "Why are you telling me this?" Cale looked at her steadily. "Because this inn is on the road between the high seat and the southern territories, and because Edric knows Roman stops here." The fire popped in the hearth. From the common room came the low sound of the men's voices. "What does that mean for me?" Josie asked. "It means be careful who you let through your door." He reached into his vest and set a small carved token on the counter. Dark wood, shaped into the angular lines of a running wolf. "Show that to anyone wearing Velthar colors. They'll know what it means." Josie picked up the token and turned it over in her fingers. The carving was precise and deep, the kind of work that took time. "This isn't just a road token," she said. "No," Cale agreed. "It's not." She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of a man who had said exactly as much as he intended to, and not one word more. She put the token in her apron pocket. Supper was louder than the first visit. The men were tired in a different way. Not the exhausted silence of people who had been riding too long, but the loosened, careful relief of people who had survived something and were still sorting out how they felt about it. They talked among themselves in the low shorthand of soldiers, and they ate with the focused appreciation of men who had been living on trail food. Roman ate at the end of the table again and said little, but Josie noticed that he watched his men with the kind of attention that didn't look like watching. The slight turn of his head when someone's voice changed. The brief glance toward the door when a gust of wind rattled the shutters. The way his hand rested on the table within easy reach of the knife at his belt, without ever actually touching it. He was always working. She understood that now. Even sitting still, even eating supper, he was working. She refilled his cup and he said without looking up, "The stable roof." She paused. "You said it was 7th on your list," he said. "When we were here before." "It's been moved up. I patched it last week." Now he looked up. "You patched it yourself?" "Pip helped with the heavy timber. I did the rest." Something moved across his expression. Not quite the shadow of a smile this time. Something more serious than that. He looked at her for a moment in the firelight, with the cut on his jaw healed and his eyes the color of deep water, and said, "You should have more help here. I have Nora. I have Pip." "That's not what I meant." Josie held his gaze. "I know what you meant," she said quietly. "I don't need a pack at my back to run a hearth, Roman." It was the first time she had used his name. She hadn't planned it. It arrived in the sentence like it had always belonged there, and she watched it land. Watched the slight shift in his expression, something that moved too fast for her to name. "No," he said, after a moment. "I don't suppose you do." It was late when the men settled for the night. 4 in the common room, 2 in the stable with the horses. Cale in the chair by the door with the self-assigned vigilance of a man who slept with one eye open as a matter of habit. Josie was banking the kitchen fire when she heard Roman's boots on the flagstones behind her. She didn't turn around. "Cale told you about Edric," he said. "He did." A pause. The fire settled in the hearth, sending a brief wash of orange light across the kitchen walls. "I should have told you myself," Roman said. She turned then, because there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not the Alpha King's measured practicality, not the commander's efficient language of need and arrangement. Something simpler than that. Something that sounded almost like accountability. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, the fur mantle gone, just the black leather and the leather bracers on his forearms, and in the lower light of the banked fire, he looked less like an Alpha King and more like a man who was very tired and had been for a long time. "You put my token in your pocket," he said. "Cale told me." "Was I not supposed to?" "You were." He looked at her directly. "I just want to make sure you understand what it means. Edric's men won't stop at asking questions if they come through here looking for information about my movements. The token tells my people you're under Velthar protection, but it also tells Edric's people whose side you're on." The fire ticked softly. Outside, snow had begun again, tapping at the shutters. Josie thought about the divorce papers against her heart, about the blue shutters she hadn't chosen, about the herb garden she would never see again, about Gareth's back, turning away. She thought about the charcoal tallies on her kitchen wall, about Nora's bread and Pip's tuneless singing and the sign on 2 good chains. "I made my choice when I put the token in my pocket," she said. Roman looked at her for a long moment. "Get some rest," he said finally. "The road east is worse tomorrow." He turned and walked back into the common room. Josie turned back to the fire, pressing her palms flat against the warm stone of the hearth the way she had on the very first night, and she listened to the snow against the shutters and the quiet sounds of the inn settling around her. She didn't sleep for a long time. Winter deepened the way it always did in the Iron Spine foothills. Not all at once, but by degrees, each morning colder than the last. The snow on the road compacting into hard-ridged ice that the horses had to pick their way across with careful feet. The pine trees along the eastern approach held their snow in heavy white clumps that dropped without warning, and the wind off the mountain passes carried a bite that got inside a cloak and stayed there, settled against the skin like something with intent. Josie learned the rhythm of the road in winter, the way she had learned everything in her life, by paying close attention and making adjustments. The travelers who came through in the cold months were different from the summer trade traffic. Fewer merchants, more soldiers, more couriers, more people moving with the specific purposefulness of those carrying things that needed to arrive somewhere. They didn't linger over supper the way summer travelers did. They ate fast and slept hard, and were back on the road before the light was fully up. Josie adapted. She kept the fire higher, the soup thicker, the bread in larger rounds that could be wrapped in cloth and taken for the road. She negotiated a supply arrangement with a shepherd 2 miles west, whose flock produced more milk than his household could use, and Nora turned it into soft cheese and butter that became, within a month, the thing travelers mentioned most when they recommended the inn. The charcoal marks on the kitchen wall multiplied. She was not happy, exactly. She was not sure happiness was the right category for what she was. But she was something solid and functional. Something that had not existed in the 2 years of blue shutters in Gareth's house, and she valued it with the fierce, specific gratitude of a person who has learned the difference between comfort and ground. Gareth came on a Tuesday. She knew it was him before she saw his face. She recognized his horse, a chestnut gelding with a white sock on the left foreleg, tied at the post outside while she was carrying water from the well. She set the bucket down and stood for a moment with her hand on the well's stone rim, taking a breath of cold air that tasted of ice and pine, and then she picked the bucket back up and went inside. He was sitting at the center table with a cup of Nora's tea, looking around the common room with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. He was wearing his good wool cloak, the dark green one he kept for important occasions, which told her this visit was deliberate and prepared. His hair was neatly combed. He had shaved recently. He looked, she thought distantly, like a man who had rehearsed something. Nora was behind the kitchen partition, very audibly not coming out. Josie set the water bucket down by the hearth and turned to face him. "Josie," he said. "Gareth." He looked at the fire, at the clean, swept floor, at the herbs drying in neat bundles from the kitchen beam. Something moved across his face. Surprise, she thought, and then something she liked even less than surprise. "You've done well with it," he said. "Yes." A pause. He turned his cup between his hands. "I heard you had Velthar riders stopping here." "I have many riders stopping here. It's an inn." "Roman Velthar specifically." His voice had an edge in it now, carefully maintained, the edge of a man trying to have a conversation that wasn't the conversation he actually wanted to have. "People are talking, Josie. You're unmated, on the border road, and the Alpha King of the Mountain Passes is stopping here regularly." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled between them. "What people say about my inn," she said very calmly, "stopped being your concern the day you handed me papers with a warm seal and turned your back." His jaw tightened. I know what you're trying to do." She kept her voice level. She had promised herself she would keep her voice level. "You came here with your good cloak and your rehearsed words, and I don't know if you want to warn me or apologize or take something back. And I don't think it matters which one it is." She held his gaze. "This is my inn, my fire, my road. You are welcome to pay for supper and sleep in the common room the same as anyone else. But you have no standing here. Gareth, not anymore." The silence was long and specific. He stood. He set 3 copper coins on the table. Too many for the tea. A gesture that meant something he didn't have words for. He picked up his cloak. At the door he stopped. "The Velthar have enemies," he said quietly. "Real ones. Be careful." "I already know," she said. He left. Nora appeared from behind the kitchen partition approximately 3 seconds later, wiping her hands on her apron with the expression of a woman who had heard every word and had no intention of pretending otherwise. "Good," she said simply. Josie picked up the copper coins and put them in the tin on the shelf. "Start on the supper bread," she said. The warning about Edric became real on a frozen Thursday, 6 weeks after the inn had opened. Josie was alone in the common room. Nora had gone to the shepherd's farm for the week's cheese. Pip was in the stable. When 3 men came through the door in the late afternoon gray. They wore traveler's clothes, plain wool, nothing that marked them as belonging to any pack. But their boots were military cut, heavy leather with iron-tipped toes, and they carried themselves with the weight distribution of men who wore armor regularly and had recently taken it off. They sat at the center table. They ordered ale. They looked at everything. The one closest to the door, thin-faced, with pale eyes, and a scar across his chin that pulled his mouth slightly crooked, looked at Josie with a specific kind of attention that had nothing to do with ale or warmth or supper. "Good fire," he said. "You get many travelers this time of year?" "Enough," Josie said. Mountain wolves? He kept his voice easy, conversational. I heard the Velthar run this road regularly. Her hand was in her apron pocket before she made the decision to put it there, fingers closing around the carved token. She kept her expression neutral. I get all kinds. Helpful. His pale eyes moved around the room again. We're looking for a friend. Traveling with a large group, dark hair, rides a black horse. You'd remember him if you'd seen him. I see a lot of men with dark hair, Josie said. The thin-faced man smiled. It did not reach his eyes. This one you'd remember. She held his gaze and thought about the token in her pocket and the knife on the kitchen counter, and Pip in the stable who was 15 years old and had no idea there were 3 armed men in the common room. She thought about Roman's voice in the kitchen. It also tells Edric's people whose side you're on. I'll bring your ale, she said. In the kitchen, she moved fast and quiet. She took the token from her pocket and pressed it into a fold of cloth, then handed it to Pip through the stable window with 3 words, North Road now. The boy's eyes widened, but he asked nothing. He was smarter than his age suggested. She went back to the common room with the ale. The 3 men stayed for an hour. They asked 3 more variations of the same question in 3 different casual framings. Josie answered each one with the pleasant vagueness of a woman who was simply too busy to notice much beyond her own hearth. When they left, the thin-faced man set a coin on the table and looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Good inn, he said. Thank you, she said. She stood at the window and watched them take the south road. And then she stood very still for a moment, with her hands flat on the sill, and breathed until her heartbeat came back down from where it had gone. Roman arrived 4 hours later, hard and fast, with Cale and 4 others, snow flying from the horse's hooves on the frozen road. He was through the door before she had fully registered the sound of the horses, filling the doorway with cold air and urgency, his eyes finding her immediately. Pip found us on the North Road, he said. 3 men? Gone south an hour after they left here. She crossed her arms. Her hands were still not entirely steady. Thin-faced one, scar across his chin. He was asking about a man with dark hair on a black horse. Roman's jaw tightened. That's Edric's man, Cale said from behind him. Ren. He's a tracker. They didn't find anything, Josie said. I didn't give them anything. Roman looked at her for a long moment. The same look as before. The one that was more than a glance. That had weight and depth, and something she still hadn't found the right name for. Then he crossed the room in 4 strides, and stopped close enough that she could smell the cold air still on his fur mantle and the pine smoke from the road. And he said, very quietly, Are you all right? It was such a simple question. Such a direct, uncomplicated question, offered with no strategy in it, no management of her reaction, no turning away. She had not been asked that question. Not like that. Not with that particular quality of attention, in longer than she could easily account for. She lifted her chin. I'm fine. Josie. I said I'm fine. She held his gaze. I did what needed doing. Pip is safe. Your location is safe. That was the job. Something moved through his expression. Complicated, layered, moving too fast for her to follow completely. He looked at her face with those deep-water eyes and said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then Cale spoke from the doorway. Roman, we need to move. If Ren went south, he's doubling back to report. We have maybe 2 hours. Roman didn't look away from Josie. Get your people somewhere safe, he said to her. Tonight, in case they come back. This is my inn, she said. I know. His voice was low, deliberate. That's why I'm asking. She looked at him, at the scar on his jaw, and the cold in his fur, and the thing in his expression she hadn't named yet, and she thought about the charcoal marks on her wall, and Nora's bread, and Pip's tuneless singing, and everything she had built in 6 weeks from nothing. I'll lock the shutters, she said. Nora and Pip sleep here. Roman held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded once and turned and walked back to his horse. He stopped at the door. "The inn," he said, without turning around. "Don't let anyone through tonight who isn't carrying Velthar colors or known to you personally." "I know," she said. He went out into the dark and the snow, and the sound of the hooves faded north, and Josie stood alone in the warm common room of her father's inn, and felt something she couldn't afford to feel yet pressing at the edges of her chest, something that had to do with the way he had looked at her when he asked if she was all right, and with the specific warmth of being seen clearly by someone who had no reason to look that carefully. She turned and went to lock the shutters. She had work to do. The attack came before dawn. Josie heard them first, not the horses, but the silence before the horses, the way the wind died, and the pine trees stopped moving, and the old bay mare in the stable made a single low sound of warning that carried through the cold air like a bell. She was already awake. She had not slept well since Roman's men had ridden north, and she had lain on her cot in the small room behind the kitchen, listening to the inn breathe around her. The settle of old timber, the tick of cooling stone, Nora's slow breath through the wall, Pip's faint snore from the stable. She was on her feet before the first shape appeared at the window. There were 5 of them. She counted by the sound. 5 sets of boots on the frozen ground outside, moving with the careful quiet of men who believed they were being subtle. Wren was among them. She could hear his particular gait, the slight drag of his left boot that she had catalogued during his hour in her common room, without knowing why she was cataloguing it. She went to Nora's door first. 1 knock, the pattern they had agreed on. She heard Nora rise immediately, heard the scrape of the heavy trunk Nora had positioned against her own door as a precaution, heard the quiet click of the knife Nora kept under her pillow being palmed. Then she went to the stable window and knocked twice on the wood, and Pip's face appeared in the gap, pale and wide-eyed and alert. "Roof," she said. "Now. Don't come down until you hear me call your name." He disappeared without a sound. She heard him go up the stable's interior ladder like a cat. She went back to the common room and stood behind the door with the iron poker from the hearth in her right hand and the carved wolf token in her left, and she waited. Wren came through the window rather than the door, which told her he was experienced and cautious and trying not to make noise. He got halfway through before the shutter she had loosened, and rebalanced gave way under him at the wrong angle, and he came through louder than he intended, catching his shoulder on the frame and stumbling into the common room with his knife already drawn. He found Josie standing 4 feet away with the poker raised and the fire at her back. For a moment they looked at each other in the firelight, the tracker with his crooked scar and his pale eyes, and the innkeeper with her braid coming loose and her gray wool dress and the iron poker in her hand. "Where is he?" Wren said. "Not a question." "Not here," Josie said. "You're lying." "I run an inn. He stops here when he's on the road. He is not on the road tonight." She kept the poker level. Her arm was trembling slightly, not from fear, she realized, but from the specific physical effort of holding iron steady at shoulder height. "You've come a long way in the cold for nothing." He took a step toward her. The door came off its hinges. Not broken. Lifted, cleanly, the pins driven up from below by sheer force. The whole door lifted out of its frame and set aside in one motion. Cold air flooded the common room, and Roman stepped through the empty doorway with 4 Velthar wolves at his back, and the particular quality of silence that followed was the kind that has weight. He had not gone north. Or he had gone north and come back, and either way he was here, filling the doorway with cold air and something that was not quite anger and not quite calm, but occupied the space between them with complete authority. His eyes went to Josie first. One look, fast and total, assessing. Then to the poker in her hand. Then to Wren. "Put it down," he said to Wren. His voice was perfectly level. That was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. Wren's pale eyes moved between Roman and Josie. His knife hand shifted fractionally. The 4 Velthar wolves behind Roman moved in the slight coordinated way of a unit that had worked together long enough to require no signal. Ren put the knife down. The other 4 outside were handled quickly, and without the violence that Josie had braced for, subdued, bound, brought into the common room where they sat against the wall under the watch of Roman's men, with the deflated expression of people whose plan has failed completely. Ren sat among them with his crooked scar and his pale eyes and the specific fury of a man who has run out of options and knows it. Cale bound Ren's wrists himself. He did it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it many times, and when he was finished he crouched in front of Ren and said very quietly, "Tell me where Edric is." Ren said nothing. "He'll keep," Roman said from across the room. His eyes were on Josie, who had put the poker down and was standing by the hearth with her arms crossed and her braid fully loose now, pale hair falling over her shoulder in the firelight. "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked at the door lying beside the doorway. "You could have knocked." Something crossed his face that was, this time, unmistakably a smile, brief and real, reaching his eyes before he controlled it. The door was faster. "I'll add it to your account." Cale made a sound from across the room that might have been a cough, and might have been something else entirely. 2 of the other wolves suddenly found their boots very interesting. They kept Ren and his men until morning, when a second group of Velthar soldiers arrived from the high seat to take them north for questioning. Roman spoke with the group's leader in the yard outside for a long time, low and deliberate, while Josie and Nora fed the soldiers breakfast, and Pip moved among them with bread and refilled cups, having descended from the stable roof the moment he heard Josie call his name, and promptly decided that the whole night's events were the most interesting thing that had ever happened to him. Josie watched Roman through the kitchen window while she turned the bread. He was different outside the inn. Larger somehow, more completely himself. The Alpha King fully present in the set of his shoulders, and the way the other wolves oriented toward him without seeming to decide to. He spoke, and people listened. He gestured once at the eastern road, and the group leader nodded and made a mark on a piece of folded parchment. He looked at the repaired stable roof briefly, and then at the inn's sign on its 2 good chains, and his expression was still and unreadable. Then he turned and looked directly at the kitchen window, as though he had known she was there the whole time. She didn't look away. He came inside after the soldiers had gone, in the quiet of mid-morning with the common room emptied, and Nora occupied in the kitchen, and Pip back in the stable. He sat at the end of the table nearest the hearth. His place, she'd come to think of it, though she had not allowed herself to examine that thought too closely, and she brought him tea and sat across from him for the first time, instead of standing. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "Edric is in the northern pass. Ren will tell Cale by tomorrow. He has reasons to cooperate now." He paused. "It will be handled within the week. And after that, the road is safe." He looked at her. "For travelers, for the inn." She nodded slowly. The fire burned between them, steady and low. "Roman," she said, "why did you come back? You went north. You were clear of the road." He was quiet for a moment. The timber settled overhead. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees. "Pip found us 2 miles out," he said. "He rode the bay mare bareback in the dark to reach us." A pause. "He told me you had sent him away to protect him and stayed in the inn alone." "It's my inn. I know." His voice had that quality again, the one that wasn't the Alpha King's language, wasn't the commander's efficiency, the one that was simpler and more difficult than either. "That's not why I came back." The fire ticked. The wind pressed at the shutters. Josie looked at him across the table, at the healed scar on his jaw and the deep-water eyes and the 12 years of holding a territory alone written in the set of his shoulders. And she said very quietly, "Then why?" He looked at her directly. No management, no strategy, no Alpha King's careful distance. "Because you were here," he said. Edric was taken in the northern pass 4 days later. Roman was not present for it. He sent Cale with a full company, and Cale returned with Edric in chains and a detailed accounting of the dismantled coalition that Roman read at the long table in the common room, while Josie brought supper and the fire burned and the inn did what inns do, warm and ordinary around the edges of extraordinary things. Edric stood trial at the high seat and was stripped of his territory and sent east, beyond the mountain range, with nothing. The coalition dissolved. The northern valleys returned to the order that Roman's 12 years had built. The road through the Iron Spine foothills became, that winter, the safest road in the territory. Roman kept stopping at the inn, not only when the road required it. Sometimes he came with his full company, the official stops of an Alpha King moving between territories. But sometimes, more often as the winter deepened and then slowly began to release, he came with only Cale, or with 2 men, or once, on a gray February afternoon, when the snow was melting off the pine trees in slow, heavy drops, alone. He sat at his table and drank Nora's tea and talked to Josie. Not about the road, not about pack politics, not about Edric or the northern valleys. He talked the way people talk when they have decided to let someone see them. Carefully at first, then less carefully, then with the particular ease of a man who has not had many people to talk to and has found, unexpectedly, one. She told him about her father, about the 30 years of the inn and the good ale and the traveling merchants and the way Willem had taught her to read a room the way some men read weather. She told him about the 2 years in Coldridge, not the pain of it, but the shape of it, the specific way a person loses themselves slowly in someone else's life, until they can't quite remember the outline of their own. He told her about the 12 years at the high seat, about the first challenge, when he was 24, and how he had been so afraid before it that he had not eaten for 2 days, and how afterward he had understood that fear and readiness were the same thing wearing different faces. About the loneliness of the high seat, which was not the loneliness of being without people. He was never without people, but the loneliness of being the one who decided, always, and bore the weight of that alone. Cale, on these visits, found reasons to be in the stable. On the last day of February, with the first suggestion of thaw in the afternoon air, and the road beginning to show mud between the ice, Roman stood at the inn door ready to leave, and turned to Josie and said, "Come to the high seat." She looked at him. "Not as a subject," he said. "Not as anything you don't choose to be." His voice was even and deliberate, each word placed with care. "Come and see it. See what I've built. And then—" He stopped. He looked at her with his deep water eyes, and the healed scar on his jaw, and all 12 years of the high seat in his shoulders, and he said, "And then decide." Josie stood in the doorway of her father's inn, her inn, with the smell of Nora's bread behind her, and the sound of Pip in the stable, and the sign on its 2 good chains above her head, swaying gently in the thaw wind. She thought about the divorce papers, about the choice she had made at 20, the one born from fear, the blue shutters she hadn't chosen, the herb garden she had planted in someone else's ground. She thought about the charcoal marks on the kitchen wall. She looked at Roman. "I'll need 3 days to arrange things with Nora," she said. The smile arrived this time, fully, completely, reaching his eyes and staying there. "3 days," he said. Epilogue. Spring came to the Iron Spine foothills the way it always did. Slowly, then all at once, the snow retreating up the mountain faces, and the pine trees shaking loose their white weight, and the road turning from ice to mud to the firm packed earth of the traveling season. The Pine Reach Inn was the finest stopping place on the eastern road by the time the first summer merchants came through, and everyone on the trade route knew it. Nora ran the kitchen with absolute authority, and an expanding repertoire that had begun to include a lamb stew with pine bark broth that travelers mentioned by name for miles in either direction. Pip, 16 now, taller than he had any right to be, managed the stable with the confident competence of someone who had grown into himself in the space of a single important winter. He had stopped going home to cold porridge. His mother, who had eventually come to see where her son spent his days, now worked 2 mornings a week helping with the linens, and had declared Nora's bread the best in the territory. The carved wolf token hung on a nail above the kitchen door, where everyone could see it. Josie went to the high seat in March, and she came back in April. And when she came back, she was different in the way that people are different when they have seen something clearly and made a choice from a place of ground rather than fear. She did not speak much about what she had decided, and she did not need to. It was visible in the way she moved through the inn. With the same confidence she had always had, the same clear-eyed practicality, but with something added to it, something that sat in her chest like a banked fire that had been given sufficient air. Roman came with the full company in May, officially, with the formality of an alpha king making a territorial stop, and also with the particular quality of attention he brought only here, the deep water eyes, and the almost smile, and the way he sat at the end of the table nearest the hearth, as if that seat had always been his. Gareth remarried in the spring, a woman from the Southern Valley who seemed suited to him in ways Josie had never been. She heard the news from the miller's apprentice, and felt nothing complicated about it. Only the clean, quiet relief of a door that had been properly closed. Cale, who had watched everything with his careful noticing eyes from the beginning, sat at the table one afternoon in early summer, while the road was busy, and the common room was warm, and Nora was arguing cheerfully with Pip about the correct way to store dried herbs, and he looked at Josie with the expression of a man whose long calculation had finally resolved. "You know," he said, "when we came through that first morning I told Roman the inn was dark and probably abandoned." Josie refilled his cup. "What did he say?" "He said he could smell a fire." Cale wrapped his hands around the cup. "He said someone had lit a fire inside not 4 hours before." A pause. "He made us stop." She looked at him. "He doesn't usually stop," Cale said simply. "In 12 years on this road, I have never seen him stop somewhere unplanned." The fire in the great iron hearth crackled and settled. Outside, the summer road was alive with horses and voices, and the ordinary movement of the world going about its business. The sign above the door swung on its 2 good chains in the warm wind. Josie set the pitcher down and looked at the fire. Her fire, in her hearth, in her father's inn that she had rebuilt with cold hands and a single dry log on the worst night of her life. And she felt the full weight of everything it had taken to get here, and found that the weight was not heavy. It was the weight of ground, solid and real and entirely her own. "He has good instincts," she said. Cale smiled into his tea. "The best I've ever seen." The summer light came through the windows and lay in long gold bars across the swept stone floor, and the inn was warm, and the road outside was full, and Josie was exactly where she had chosen to be. Not because she had been placed there, not because someone else had decided it for her, because she had built it, board by board, fire by fire, day by day, in the cold and the dark and the snow, with her own hands and her own will and no one's permission. And that, more than anything else, more than the token on the wall, or the man with the deep water eyes, or the sign on its 2 good chains, was the thing that could never be taken from her again.